billion-dollar military contracting empire. His company manufactured everything from tactical gear to advanced surveillance equipment. But Grant's real expertise lay in something more personal: psychological warfare. His childhood had been a masterclass in survival. Abandoned by his mother at 8 and raised by an alcoholic father who beat him nightly, Grant learned early that weakness invited predators. The defining moment came at 15 when his father sold his college fund for whiskey. That night, Grant didn't just fight back. He systematically destroyed every bottle in the house, then calmly informed his father that the next time he touched him, he'd wake up in a morgue. His father never touched him again. Grant met Candace Kane at a charity gala 5 years ago. She was 28, stunningly beautiful, and working as an event coordinator. Her sob story about growing up in foster care and struggling to make ends meet had touched something in him, a rare vulnerability. She represented the family he'd never had, the normal life he thought he wanted. The wedding was modest by his standards, though Candace had pushed for something grander. She moved into his estate immediately, seemingly content with the luxurious lifestyle his wealth provided. When she became pregnant 6 months later, Grant felt something he'd never experienced: hope for a different kind of legacy. Little Ethan Harmon was born with Grant's steel-gray eyes and his mother's delicate features. At 3 years old, he was the only person on Earth who could make Grant Harmon smile without calculation. The boy would climb onto his father's lap during business calls, drawing crayon pictures of airplanes and soldiers. Grant kept every single drawing in a locked safe in his office. But Grant's business demanded extensive travel, and he'd noticed changes in Candace over the past year. She'd become distant, irritable, always checking her phone. She'd started going to yoga classes and book clubs that seemed to run increasingly late. Grant's instincts, honed by years of reading adversaries across negotiation tables, whispered warnings he chose to ignore. After all, he had bigger concerns. His latest contract with the Department of Defense was worth $300 million, developing next-generation surveillance systems for overseas operations. The prototype used advanced facial recognition and behavioral analysis algorithms, technology that could track anyone, anywhere, once their pattern was established. Grant stood in his gun range now, methodically putting rounds through targets at varying distances. Each shot was perfect, just as his father had taught him before the drinking took over completely. Precision, patience, and preparation, the three pillars that had built his empire. Upstairs, Candace was preparing Thanksgiving dinner with unusual enthusiasm. She'd invited her friend, Javier Keller, to join them, claiming he had nowhere else to go. Grant had met Javier twice, a smooth-talking personal trainer who worked at Candace's gym. Something about the man's overly friendly demeanor and lingering looks at Candace set Grant's teeth on edge, but he'd agreed to the dinner invitation. As Grant climbed the stairs from his basement range, he could hear Ethan's laughter echoing from the kitchen. His son was helping Candace by spreading flour across every available surface while she prepared the stuffing. The domestic scene should have warmed him, but Grant noticed how frequently Candace glanced at her phone, how her smile seemed forced. "Daddy!" Ethan launched himself at Grant's legs, covering his black tactical pants with tiny handprints of flour. "Mommy's making turkey, and I'm helping." Grant scooped up his son, genuinely smiling for the first time all day. "I can see that, soldier. Looks like you're winning the war against that flour." Candace barely looked up from her preparations. "Javier should be here soon. I hope you don't mind that I invited him. He's been so helpful at the gym, and he mentioned he'd be spending Thanksgiving alone." Grant's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained neutral. "Of course. The more the merrier." The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock. Javier Keller stood on the threshold with a bottle of expensive wine and his trademark easy smile. He was 35, athletically built, with the kind of manufactured charm that came from years of selling himself to lonely housewives. "Grant, thanks so much for having me, man. This place is incredible." Javier's handshake was firm, but lasted a beat too long, and his eyes swept the foyer with obvious calculation. Dinner proceeded normally enough. Javier entertained them with stories from the gym, carefully avoiding any mention of his private training sessions with Candace. He complimented the food extensively, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically. Grant noticed how Candace blushed at every compliment, how their eyes met across the table with an intimacy that made his jaw clench. Little Ethan dominated the conversation, regaling Uncle Javier with elaborate stories about his toy soldiers and the fort he'd built in his bedroom. Javier listened with genuine attention, occasionally glancing at Candace with an expression Grant couldn't quite read. As they finished the main course, Candace disappeared into the kitchen to prepare dessert. She returned with individual portions of pumpkin mousse, setting them down with unusual ceremony. "I made these special," she announced, her voice carrying a strange, nervous energy. "A new recipe I found online. I hope everyone likes them." Grant noticed she served herself last, taking her portion from a different tray. He also noticed that both his and Ethan's desserts had a slightly different color than the others, a subtle difference most people would miss, but Grant missed nothing. His survival instincts, dormant for years of comfortable marriage, suddenly blazed to life. The timing was too perfect. Javier's invitation, Candace's nervous energy, the separate serving trays. His mind raced through possibilities, each more chilling than the last. But it was too late. Ethan had already taken a large spoonful, grinning as chocolate smeared across his cheek. "This is really good, Mommy." Grant took a smaller bite, his taste buds immediately detecting something bitter beneath the sweetness. The metallic taste was subtle but unmistakable. He'd tasted it before in military rations that had been contaminated. His blood ran cold as he recognized the symptoms beginning in his son: slight dizziness, dilated pupils, difficulty focusing. Within minutes, both Grant and Ethan were struggling to breathe. Grant's vision blurred as he watched his son's small body convulse. The last thing he heard before losing consciousness was Candace's voice, cold and calculated, speaking to Javier with chilling clarity. "This will work out perfectly. If those two weren't here, we could finally be together without any complications. The insurance money will set us up for life, and no one will ever suspect anything. Just two tragic victims of a gas leak." Chapter 2. The Reckoning. Grant Harmon awakened to the sterile smell of antiseptic and the steady beep of medical monitors. His throat burned, his head pounded, and every breath felt like swallowing glass. But he was alive, which meant his calculation had been correct. Candace had underestimated the dosage needed for someone his size. A woman in a lab coat leaned over him, checking his pupils with a small flashlight. "Mr. Harmon, can you hear me? I'm Dr. Amanda Beasley. You're at St. Mary's Hospital in Billings." Grant's voice came out as a rasp. "My son." Dr. Beasley's expression tightened, and Grant's blood turned to ice. "Mr. Harmon, I'm very sorry. We did everything we could for Ethan, but the poison had already caused too much damage to his respiratory system. He passed away 3 hours ago." The words hit Grant like a physical blow. His vision darkened at the edges, but not from the poison, from a rage so pure and consuming it threatened to incinerate everything in its path. His little boy, his soldier, was gone, murdered by the woman he'd trusted with his heart and the stranger he'd welcomed into his home. 2 men in suits approached his bedside. The older one, a weathered man with intelligent eyes, introduced himself as Detective Bob Richards. His partner, a younger man named Austin Patton, hung back taking notes. "Mr. Harmon, I know this is difficult, but we need to ask you some questions about what happened tonight," Detective Richards said gently. "The preliminary toxicology report shows you and your son ingested a significant amount of strychnine. The source appears to be the dessert you were served." Grant forced himself to focus through the haze of grief and fury. "Where's my wife?" Detective Patton stepped forward. "Mrs. Harmon is being questioned separately. She and Mr. Keller both claim they have no idea how the poison got into the food. They're suggesting it might have been an accident, contaminated ingredients, or a gas leak that was somehow missed." "That's impossible," Grant croaked. "I tasted it. The poison was specifically in our portions." Detective Richards leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Mr. Harmon, I have to ask, was there any trouble in your marriage? Any reason your wife might want to hurt you or your son?" Grant's mind raced. He could tell them about his suspicions, about the way Candace and Javier looked at each other, about the separate serving trays. But something held him back, a cold calculation that surprised him with its clarity even in his grief. No, he lied smoothly. We were happy. Very happy. The detectives exchanged glances. The reason your son died was complications from strychnine poisoning, Detective Richards continued. But Mr. Harmon, something doesn't add up here. According to Mrs. Harmon and Mr. Keller, they ate the same dessert and had no ill effects. We're waiting for full lab results on the remaining portions. Grant nodded weakly, already planning. Understand. I want to cooperate fully with your investigation. After the detectives left, Grant lay in the darkness of his hospital room, his mind working with crystalline precision. Candace had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated him. She thought he was just another wealthy husband who could be eliminated for his money. She had no idea she'd just awakened something far more dangerous than she could imagine. Grant Harmon had built an empire by understanding his enemies better than they understood themselves. He'd negotiated with warlords, outmaneuvered international competitors, and survived assassination attempts in 3 different countries. Candace and Javier had just declared war on the wrong man. Over the next 2 days, while pretending to grieve in his hospital bed, Grant began planning their destruction. He used his encrypted satellite phone to contact his head of security, a former Special Forces operator named Roland Jensen. I need complete surveillance on my wife and Javier Keller, Grant whispered into the phone during a shift change. Everything, where they go, who they talk to, what they eat for breakfast. I want their entire lives documented. Roland's gravelly voice came through clearly. You thinking what I'm thinking, boss? I'm thinking my son is dead and someone's going to pay for it. Consider it done. What about the legal stuff? Grant's smile was razor sharp. Let the police do their job. They'll find evidence, but it won't be enough for conviction. Too much reasonable doubt. But that's fine. I'm not interested in justice. I'm interested in revenge. Meanwhile, Grant began receiving visitors. His business partners offered condolences and assured him that Harmon Defense Systems would continue running smoothly in his absence. His lawyer, Milton Gutierrez, arrived with documents to sign and carefully worded questions about Grant's will and insurance policies. But the most interesting visitor was Chris Fuller, a former CIA operative who now worked as Grant's special projects consultant. Chris specialized in the kind of problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. I'm sorry about Ethan, Chris said quietly, his scarred face showing genuine emotion. He was a good kid. Grant's jaw tightened. I want them destroyed, Chris. Not just killed, completely annihilated. I want them to suffer like my son suffered. Chris nodded slowly. What kind of timeline are we looking at? However long it takes. I want this to be perfect. On the 3rd day, Candace visited him. She arrived with red-rimmed eyes and clutching tissues, playing the grieving widow and mother to perfection. Grant had to admire her acting ability. If he hadn't heard her true voice that night, he might have believed her performance. Grant, oh my God, I'm so sorry, she sobbed, throwing her arms around him. Our baby, our poor baby. The doctor said it was some kind of contamination, maybe from the organic farm where I bought the ingredients. I feel so responsible. Grant held her gently, stroking her hair with hands that wanted to snap her neck. It's not your fault, sweetheart. These things happen. We'll get through this together. Candace pulled back, her eyes swimming with crocodile tears. The insurance company has been asking questions. They want to do a full investigation before they pay out the life insurance policies. It's so horrible having to deal with money when our son is gone. Grant's expression remained sympathetic even as his mind noted the telling detail she already knew about the life insurance investigation. That meant she and Javier were already planning their next moves. Don't worry about the money, he said softly. We have more than enough. The important thing is honoring Ethan's memory. Candace nodded, dabbing at her eyes. Javier's been such a help through all this. I don't know what I would have done without him. He's been handling the funeral arrangements since you've been in here. Grant's smile didn't waver. He's a good friend. I'm grateful to him. That night, Grant received a secure message from Roland Jensen. The surveillance had already yielded results. Candace and Javier had been seen together at a hotel in town, celebrating with champagne and discussing travel plans. The audio equipment had picked up fragments of conversation about getting the money and starting fresh somewhere tropical. But more interesting was a background check on Javier Keller. The man's real name was Javier Martinez, and he had a history of targeting wealthy women. 2 previous girlfriends had died in suspicious circumstances, one in a car accident after changing her will, another from a supposed drug overdose that left Javier as the beneficiary of her life insurance policy. Grant stared at the photos of the 2 dead women, both blonde and attractive like Candace. His wife hadn't just been unfaithful. She'd chosen a partner who made murder his profession. Chapter 3. The Preparation. Grant Harmon was released from the hospital on a gray November morning, 5 days after his son's murder. The media had picked up the story. Defense contractor's son dies in Thanksgiving tragedy, but Grant's security team had managed to keep most details private. To the outside world, it appeared to be a terrible accident involving contaminated food. The funeral was held at St. Andrew's Cathedral, a Gothic stone church that Grant had never attended but Candace had insisted upon. As he sat in the front pew, watching his son's tiny casket being carried down the aisle, Grant felt something inside him crystallize into diamond-hard resolve. Candace sat beside him, dressed in black and playing her role perfectly. She held his hand, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Javier sat 3 rows back, appropriately respectful, wearing an expensive suit that Grant recognized as coming from his own credit card statements. The service was beautiful in its simplicity. Pastor Milton Gutierrez, a distant cousin of Grant's lawyer, delivered a moving eulogy about innocence lost and the mysteries of God's plan. Grant barely heard the words. His attention was focused on the subtle glances between Candace and Javier, the way they carefully avoided direct eye contact while remaining acutely aware of each other's presence. After the burial, guests gathered at the Harmon estate for a reception. Grant moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting condolences and maintaining his facade of devastated widower and father. But his eyes never stopped working, cataloging who spoke to whom, noting which conversations ceased when he approached. Detective Richards pulled him aside in his study, away from the mourners. "Mr. Harmon, I wanted to update you on our investigation. The lab results came back on the dessert samples." Grant's pulse quickened, but his expression remained neutral. "And the strychnine was definitely present in your and Ethan's portions, but not in the others. The concentration was precise, almost surgical. This wasn't an accident or contamination. Someone with knowledge of poisons did this deliberately. Do you have any suspects?" Detective Richards hesitated. "We're looking at everyone who had access to the kitchen that day. Your wife and Mr. Keller both claim they never left the dining room while the desserts were being prepared, but we're still gathering evidence." Grant nodded gravely. "I appreciate everything you're doing, Detective. My son deserves justice." "There's something else," Richards continued. "We ran background checks on everyone present that night. Mr. Keller has some interesting history. 2 previous female companions who died under suspicious circumstances. Both cases were ruled accidental, but the pattern is concerning." Grant allowed surprise to flicker across his face. "Are you saying Javier might have been involved in other murders?" "I'm saying we're investigating all possibilities." "Mr. Harmon, I have to ask, had your wife been acting differently lately? Any signs she might have been involved with Mr. Keller romantically?" Grant paused, as if considering the painful possibility for the first time. I've been traveling a lot for business. I suppose there might have been signs I missed. Candace had been distant, but I thought it was just stress from managing the household alone. We'd like to conduct more extensive interviews with both your wife and Mr. Keller. With your permission, we'd also like to examine your home more thoroughly." "Of course. I want the truth, whatever it is." After the detective left, Grant retreated to his basement office, a secure room that Candace had never been allowed to enter. The space was lined with monitors displaying feeds from hidden cameras throughout his property. He'd installed the surveillance system years ago as a security measure, but now it would serve a different purpose. Roland Jensen was waiting for him, along with Chris Fuller and a third man Grant hadn't seen in years, Stan Glass, a former NSA analyst who specialized in digital forensics and identity manipulation. "Gentlemen," Grant said, settling into his chair behind a massive oak desk. "Thank you for coming. As you know, my son was murdered by my wife and her lover. The police will eventually gather enough evidence to arrest them, but conviction is far from certain. Javier Keller is apparently experienced at this kind of crime, and Candace is more cunning than I gave her credit for." Chris Fuller leaned forward. "What do you need from us?" Grant's smile was arctic. "I need them to disappear. Permanently. But not quickly. I want them to suffer first. I want them to understand what they took from me before they die." Stan Glass spoke up, his nasal voice carrying decades of analytical precision. "What's the timeline? If they suspect you know the truth, they might run." "They won't run," Grant said confidently. "They're waiting for the insurance money. $50 million in life insurance on me, plus another $10 million on Ethan. They think they're smarter than everyone else. That arrogance will be their downfall." Roland Jensen cracked his knuckles. "What about the investigation? The cops seemed pretty convinced it was murder." Grant pulled up files on his computer screen. "Detective Richards is competent but overworked. The district attorney won't prosecute without overwhelming evidence, and Javier's too experienced to leave obvious traces. They'll probably arrest them, maybe even get an indictment, but conviction is unlikely. So we help them get away with it?" Chris asked, confused. Grant's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh no, we let them think they've gotten away with it. We let them collect the insurance money, maybe even start planning their new life together. And then..." He stood and walked to a wall safe, removing a thick folder. "Then we implement the Lazarus Protocol." The three men exchanged glances. The Lazarus Protocol was Grant's most classified project, a theoretical framework for completely erasing someone's identity and rebuilding it from scratch. It had been developed for deep cover operatives who needed to vanish completely, but Grant had always envisioned other applications. Stan Glass whistled softly as he flipped through the documents. "You want to make them disappear and then hunt them as different people?" "I want them to live in fear," Grant said quietly. "I want them to never feel safe, never know when death is coming." Ethan died in terror, not understanding why he couldn't breathe. They'll experience the same fear, but it will last months, maybe years. Chris Fuller nodded slowly. "It's doable, but it'll require perfect timing. One mistake, and the whole thing falls apart." Grant returned to his desk and opened another file, detailed psychological profiles of both Candace and Javier, compiled from years of surveillance and analysis. "I've been studying them longer than they realize. Candace is driven by greed and social status. She wants luxury and admiration. Javier is a predator who enjoys the hunt almost as much as the kill. They both have specific weaknesses we can exploit." Roland Jensen studied the surveillance photos. "When do we start?" Grant looked up at a framed photo of Ethan on his desk, his son laughing as he built a tower of blocks. "We start now. But first, we let them think they've won." Over the next 2 weeks, Grant played his role perfectly. He seemed to sink into depression, barely eating, speaking little, spending long hours alone. He made it clear that he suspected nothing about Candace's infidelity or involvement in the murders. To the outside world, he appeared to be a broken man consumed by grief. Meanwhile, his team worked with surgical precision. Stan Glass began creating false identities and paper trails that would allow Candace and Javier to disappear once they collected the insurance money. Chris Fuller established surveillance networks in potential destination countries. Roland Jensen recruited assets, people with specialized skills who could be activated when needed. Candace and Javier grew bolder as Grant's apparent breakdown continued. They began meeting openly, though still maintaining their cover story of friendship and support during difficult times. The insurance company completed its investigation and prepared to release the funds. Everything was proceeding exactly as Grant had planned. Soon, his son's murderers would think they had escaped justice. But Grant Harmon was patient, and he had learned long ago that the sweetest revenge was the kind that came when your enemies felt safest. The real game was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Deception. 3 months after Ethan's funeral, the insurance checks finally arrived. $60 million, split between various policies that Candace and Grant had taken out over the years. To the outside world, Grant appeared to be struggling with alcoholism and depression, barely functioning enough to sign the necessary documents. In reality, every stumble, every slurred word, every appearance of weakness was carefully calculated. Grant had learned the art of deception from masters. Military contractors who operated in the gray spaces between nations, where showing your true strength meant death. Candace's performance as the concerned widow was equally convincing. She attended grief counseling sessions, joined a support group for parents who had lost children, and maintained a facade of loyalty to her devastated husband. But Grant's surveillance network captured the truth. Late-night phone calls with Javier, secret apartment visits, and increasingly detailed discussions about their future together. The breakthrough came on a cold February evening when Chris Fuller intercepted a conversation between Candace and Javier in their hotel room across town. The money's finally cleared. Candace's voice came through clearly on the encrypted recording. $60 million, just like we planned. Grant signed everything without even reading it. Javier's laugh was cold and satisfied. I told you he was weak. All these tough businessman types are the same. They fall apart when things get personal. How long before we can access the accounts? Everything's set up in the Cayman Islands, just like you wanted. I'll transfer the money next week, and then we can disappear. I'm thinking Costa Rica first, maybe the Maldives after that. What about Grant? You sure he doesn't suspect anything? Candace's voice turned predatory. He's so far gone he can barely tie his shoes. The man who used to intimidate Fortune 500 CEOs now cries every time he sees a picture of Ethan. It's actually pathetic. Grant listened to the recording in his secure office, feeling the familiar cold rage settle over him like armor. They thought they had broken him. They thought they had won. Perfect. The next phase of his plan required perfect timing. Grant began making mistakes, small ones at first, then increasingly obvious. He forgot to sign important business documents. He missed crucial meetings. His board of directors grew concerned about his mental state and his ability to lead Harmon Defense Systems. Milton Gutierrez, his lawyer, visited the estate with documents for Grant to sign, papers that would temporarily transfer operational control of his company to a board of trustees while he recovered from his grief. Grant made a show of resistance before reluctantly agreeing. I just need time, he said brokenly, his hands shaking as he signed. Everything reminds me of Ethan. Maybe if I get away for a while. Candace seized the opening immediately. Darling, maybe a change of scenery would be good for you. We could travel, maybe take that trip to Europe you always talked about. Grant looked up at her with eyes that seemed hollow with grief. You'd do that for me? After everything we've been through? Of course, she said, stroking his hair with practiced tenderness. We need to heal together. But Grant knew her real motivation. Candace wanted him out of the country when she and Javier made their final move. She was probably planning to arrange another accident, maybe a car crash in the Alps or a drowning in the Mediterranean. The grieving widow would return home with her lover, and no one would question their relationship. Grant played along, making travel arrangements through his usual channels. But he also activated a different set of protocols. Stan Glass began creating a new identity for Grant, complete with passport, financial accounts, and carefully constructed history. When Grant Harmon died, in whatever accident Candace had planned, Marcus Webb would be born. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Candace and Javier would think they had succeeded in murdering Grant, just as they had murdered Ethan. They would claim the remaining assets, consolidate their wealth, and disappear to live their dream life in tropical paradise. But Grant Harmon wouldn't be dead. He would be hunting them with resources they couldn't imagine and a patience they couldn't understand. And when he finally revealed himself, they would realize that they hadn't killed their victim. They had created their own personal demon. 2 weeks before their planned departure to Europe, Detective Richards requested another meeting with Grant. The investigation into Ethan's murder had stalled, with insufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Richards looked frustrated and exhausted as he delivered the news. I'm sorry, Mr. Harmon. We know your wife and Javier Keller were involved, but proving it in court is another matter. They've both maintained their alibis, and without direct evidence of them preparing the poison. Grant nodded numbly. I understand, Detective. You did your best. The case isn't closed, Richards insisted. If new evidence surfaces, we'll pursue it aggressively. And I want you to know, I believe your son was murdered. I believe you were supposed to die that night. But belief isn't enough for a conviction. After Richards left, Grant allowed himself a moment of genuine emotion. His son would never receive official justice. The legal system had failed, just as Grant had known it would. But there were other kinds of justice, older kinds, that didn't require courtrooms or juries. That evening, Candace prepared dinner with unusual care. She'd been cooking more often lately, probably practicing for her new life with Javier. Grant ate everything she served, having taken precautions that rendered any poison ineffective. Candace seemed disappointed when he showed no ill effects, confirming his suspicion that she was testing various methods. "Grant, there's something I need to tell you," she said as they finished dessert. "I've been thinking about our marriage, about everything that's happened. I love you, but I think we need time apart to process our grief separately." Grant looked up at her with apparent confusion. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe I shouldn't come to Europe with you. Maybe you need to take this journey alone, find yourself again. I'll stay here and keep the house ready for when you return." Grant's performance was flawless. The hurt husband who couldn't understand why his wife would abandon him in his darkest hour. "Candace, please. I need you with me. I can't do this alone." She reached across the table and took his hand, her touch cold despite the warmth of her words. "You're stronger than you think, Grant. This will be good for both of us. Trust me. Trust her." The woman who had murdered his son was asking him to trust her. Grant squeezed her hand gently, meeting her eyes with perfect sincerity. "I do trust you," he said softly. "I always have." 3 days later, Grant Harmon boarded a private jet bound for Geneva, Switzerland. Candace saw him off at the private airfield, tears streaming down her face as she waved goodbye. Javier was conspicuously absent, though Grant's surveillance team confirmed he was watching from a nearby hotel. The jet took off on schedule, flew across the Pacific, and landed in Geneva 8 hours later. According to all official records, Grant Harmon checked into the Hotel de Bergs, had dinner alone in his room, and retired for the evening. But Grant Harmon never made it to his hotel room. Somewhere between the airport and the city center, he disappeared completely. By morning, Marcus Webb was on a different flight to a different country, carrying documents that would pass any inspection and accessing accounts that had been carefully prepared over months of planning. The real hunt was about to begin. Chapter 5. The Vanishing. The call came at 3:17 a.m. Montana time. Candace answered her phone with practiced sleepiness, though she had been wide awake, waiting. "Mrs. Harmon? This is Inspector Phil Driscoll with the Geneva Police Department. I'm afraid I have terrible news about your husband." Candace's gasp was perfectly pitched, shock giving way to growing dread. "What happened? Is Grant hurt?" "Ma'am, I'm very sorry to inform you that your husband was found dead earlier this evening. His body was recovered from Lake Geneva. Preliminary investigation suggests he may have taken his own life." The scream that followed was worthy of an Academy Award. Candace collapsed to her knees in her nightgown, sobbing into the phone while Javier rushed to comfort her. He had been hiding in the guest bedroom, but now he held her openly, whispering reassurances as she wailed with apparent grief. "No, no, that's impossible," she cried. "Grant would never." He was getting better. He was looking forward to the trip. Inspector Driscoll's voice carried practiced sympathy. "I understand this is shocking, Mrs. Harmon. Your husband left a note expressing his inability to cope with your son's death. He apparently walked into the lake near the Jet d'Eau fountain sometime after midnight. The details had been meticulously planned. Marcus Webb, using resources Grant had developed over years of international operations, had staged the perfect suicide. Security cameras showed a figure matching Grant's height and build walking toward the lake. The body, actually a carefully prepared substitute obtained through channels that existed in the gray spaces between legal and illegal, carried Grant's identification and DNA samples. The Swiss police, dealing with what appeared to be a straightforward suicide by a grief-stricken American tourist, conducted a perfunctory investigation. The body was cremated within days, as specified in Grant's will. The ashes were shipped back to Montana, where Candace held another beautiful funeral service. This time, her grief was mixed with poorly concealed relief. She had successfully murdered both her husband and stepson, inheriting one of America's largest defense fortunes. The insurance companies, having already paid out on Ethan's death, processed Grant's life insurance claims with minimal scrutiny. Another $60 million flowed into accounts that Candace controlled. Javier moved into the estate openly now, though they maintained the fiction that he was simply helping Candace manage her affairs during her time of mourning. The local community offered sympathy and support to the young widow who had lost everything. But 50 miles away, in a secure facility that officially didn't exist, Marcus Webb was planning the next phase of his campaign. The man who had been Grant Harmon was gone, erased as completely as if he had never existed. In his place was someone with different fingerprints, retinal patterns, and DNA markers. Modifications that had cost millions of dollars and involved procedures that weren't available to ordinary citizens. Marcus Webb was 45 years old, according to his meticulously crafted identity. He was a former military contractor who had made his fortune in Africa and the Middle East before retiring to a quiet life of international travel. His wealth was real. Grant had spent years moving assets through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. But his face, his voice, even his mannerisms had been carefully altered. The transformation had taken 6 months of preparation and 3 months of recovery. Plastic surgery, vocal coaching, and intensive physical therapy had created a man who bore no resemblance to Grant Harmon. Even people who had known Grant intimately would never recognize Marcus Webb. Webb's first target wasn't Candace or Javier directly. Instead, he began a careful campaign of psychological pressure designed to slowly drive them apart. His resources were vast: former intelligence operatives, hackers, and specialists in identity manipulation. Every aspect of their new life together would be systematically contaminated with doubt and fear. It started with small things: money transfers that were delayed or redirected, hotel reservations that were mysteriously canceled, credit cards that stopped working at crucial moments. Webb's team used their knowledge of international banking systems to create a steady stream of minor but maddening obstacles. Candace and Javier initially attributed these problems to normal friction in moving large amounts of money internationally. But as the incidents multiplied, they began to feel targeted. Paranoia crept into their conversations, captured in detail by Webb's surveillance network. "Something's wrong," Javier muttered as he hung up from another frustrating call with their Swiss bank. "These aren't random computer glitches. Someone's screwing with us." Candace tried to remain calm, but Webb could see the stress lines forming around her eyes. "Who would even know about our accounts? We've been so careful. Maybe too careful. Maybe someone noticed all the transfers and flagged us for investigation." The beauty of Webb's strategy was its subtlety. He wasn't attacking them directly. He was allowing their own guilt and paranoia to poison their relationship. Every setback made them more suspicious of each other, more likely to make mistakes. The psychological pressure intensified when Webb began targeting their personal lives. Javier received anonymous tips that suggested Candace was hiding money from him. Candace discovered evidence that Javier had been researching ways to eliminate partners in international fraud cases. Neither piece of evidence was entirely fabricated. Webb's team had simply amplified existing character flaws and presented them in the worst possible light. Javier was indeed the type of man who would eliminate Candace once she was no longer useful. Candace was indeed planning to eventually dispose of Javier once they reached their final destination. But now they suspected each other earlier than planned, before they had finished relocating their assets. Their dream paradise became a prison of mutual distrust. Webb monitored their relationship's deterioration from his base in Singapore, where Marcus Webb officially resided. He felt no satisfaction in their suffering. That would come later. For now, he was simply laying groundwork, preparing the foundation for their eventual destruction. The first major crack in their partnership came when Javier discovered that Candace had been secretly transferring money to personal accounts that he couldn't access. His confrontation was violent and public. taking place in the lobby of their luxury hotel in the Cayman Islands. "You lying bitch," Javier shouted, his carefully maintained charm finally cracking. "You've been planning to cut me out from the beginning." Candace's response was equally venomous. "Maybe because I know exactly what kind of man you are. How many other women have you murdered, Javier? How long before you decide I'm a liability?" Hotel security intervened before the fight became physical, but the damage was done. Their relationship was now openly adversarial, each one preparing for the other's betrayal. They continued traveling together because neither trusted the other enough to separate, but their partnership had become a Cold War. Webb allowed them to stew in their mutual paranoia for 3 more months before implementing the next phase. He needed them desperate and isolated before he revealed himself. He needed them to understand that their sins had not been forgotten. Soon, they would learn that the dead could indeed rise again, and that some ghost came back for vengeance. Chapter 6. The Revelation. Marcus Webb watched through high-powered binoculars as Candace and Javier emerged from their villa in Costa Rica. 6 months had passed since Grant Harmon's supposed suicide, and the couple had finally settled into what they believed was their permanent paradise. The villa was spectacular, perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, with infinity pools and private beaches that cost $20,000 a month to rent. But paradise had become a cage. Webb's psychological campaign had taken its toll. Candace had lost 15 pounds and developed a nervous habit of constantly checking her phone. Javier had started drinking heavily and carried a pistol even when swimming. They rarely spoke to each other except to argue about money or express suspicions about their rapidly shrinking social circle. Webb had systematically eliminated everyone they tried to befriend. New acquaintances received anonymous tips about the couple's suspicious wealth. Potential business partners discovered troubling information about their backgrounds. Local authorities received carefully crafted reports suggesting money laundering and tax evasion. The result was complete isolation. Candace and Javier had the money they'd killed for, but they couldn't enjoy it. Every pleasure was tainted by paranoia. Every sunset was watched through bulletproof glass. Every meal was tested for poison, a delicious irony that Webb savored. Today would mark the beginning of the final phase. Webb had spent months studying their routines, their weaknesses, their fears. He knew that Candace was terrified of being poor again, having grown up in foster care with nothing. He knew that Javier's greatest fear was being trapped, unable to escape when things went wrong. Webb would give them both exactly what they feared most. The plan began at 2 p.m. local time, when Javier received a phone call from someone claiming to be Detective Austin Patton from Montana. The voice was perfect. Webb's vocal specialist had studied hours of recordings to reproduce Patton's exact speech patterns. "Mr. Keller, this is Detective Patton from the Billings Police Department. I need to inform you that we've reopened the investigation into Ethan Harmon's death. New evidence has come to light that directly implicates you and Mrs. Harmon." Javier's face went white as Webb watched through concealed cameras. "That's impossible. We were cleared months ago." "I'm afraid not, sir. We have witnesses who saw you purchasing strychnine from a black market supplier in Denver 3 weeks before the murder. We also have financial records showing payments to individuals with expertise in untraceable poisons." The evidence was fabricated, but convincingly so. Webb's team had spent weeks creating a paper trail that would withstand casual investigation. More importantly, the accusations fed into Javier's existing paranoia. "We've issued international arrest warrants," the fake detective continued. "The Costa Rican authorities will be executing them within 48 hours. I'd advise you to retain legal counsel immediately." Javier hung up and immediately confronted Candace, who was sunbathing by the pool. Web surveillance captured every word of their panicked conversation. "We're blown," Javier said without preamble. "The Montana cops say they have evidence linking us to the kid's murder. They're coming for us." Candace bolted upright, her face cycling through shock, fear, and calculation. "That's impossible. We were so careful. Apparently not careful enough. They mentioned black market poison purchases and financial records. How did they get that information?" Candace's paranoia immediately focused on the most obvious target. You said you covered your tracks. You promised me there was no way to trace the strychnine. I did cover them. Unless... Javier's eyes narrowed. Unless someone helped them. Someone who knew enough about our operation to point them in the right direction. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe you decided to eliminate a partner. Maybe you figured you could pin everything on me and walk away clean. The accusation sparked a screaming match that lasted 30 minutes. Webb recorded every word, every threat, every revelation about their true feelings for each other. By the end, they were both convinced that the other had betrayed them to the authorities. But Webb wasn't finished. At 6 p.m., Candace received her own call, this one supposedly from Inspector Phil Driscoll in Geneva. Mrs. Harmon, I have disturbing news about your husband's death. Our forensic team has discovered evidence that suggests Mr. Harmon may have been murdered rather than committing suicide. Candace's blood pressure spiked so dramatically that Webb could see her pulse in her neck through his binoculars. What kind of evidence? Defensive wounds that were initially overlooked, signs of a struggle near the water. We've also discovered that someone matching Mr. Keller's description was seen near the lake that night. We believe your husband was murdered for his insurance money. The fake inspector delivered the killing blow with perfect timing. We've frozen all assets connected to Mr. Harmon's estate pending a full investigation. This includes the insurance payments you received. Interpol is coordinating with multiple agencies to track down everyone involved in this conspiracy. Candace hung up and immediately began packing, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fold her clothes. When Javier returned from a liquor run, he found her stuffing cash into a duffel bag. What the hell are you doing? They know about Grant, she said without looking up. They know he was murdered. They're freezing all our assets. Javier stared at her with growing comprehension. You killed him. You actually went to Geneva and killed him. Of course I killed him. That was always the plan. But now they have evidence linking you to the scene. Me? I was never in Geneva. Then how do they have witness descriptions? Their relationship imploded completely. Years of carefully maintained pretense evaporated in minutes of raw accusation and counteraccusation. They screamed at each other with the fury of two predators who suddenly realized they'd been caged together. But the real shock was yet to come. At exactly 8 p.m., as the couple huddled in their villa trying to plan their next move, the lights went out. Emergency generators kicked in a moment later, but the message was clear. Someone had taken control of their sanctuary. A voice came through the villa's intercom system, calm and cultured and terrifyingly familiar. Hello, Candace. Hello, Javier. I trust you're enjoying your evening. Candace's face went gray with recognition. Javier spun toward the speakers, his pistol already in his hand. That's impossible, Candace whispered. You're dead. I saw your body. Death is such a limiting concept, the voice continued. I prefer to think of it as a career change. You see, when you murder my son, you didn't just kill a 3-year-old boy. You awakened something much more dangerous. The villa screens flickered to life, showing surveillance footage from the past 6 months. Candace and Javier watched in horror as their entire new life was revealed to be an elaborate theater performance. Every setback, every moment of paranoia, every fear, all of it had been orchestrated by the man they thought they had killed. Grant. Candace's voice was barely a whisper. Grant Harmon died in Geneva, just as you planned. But you should have made sure you killed the right man. You see, my dear wife, you underestimated me. You thought I was just another wealthy husband who could be eliminated for his money. You had no idea that you were declaring war on someone who makes war his profession. Javier emptied his pistol into the nearest speaker, but the voice continued from others throughout the house. The police calls you received today were fake, of course, but the evidence they described is quite real. I've been constructing your prosecution for months, creating a trail that leads directly to both of you. The Costa Rican authorities will indeed be here soon, but not for the reasons you think. The final twist came with perfect theatrical timing. The villa's main screen displayed a live video feed showing local police surrounding the property. But these weren't Costa Rican officers. They were Marcus Webb's private security team, dressed in official uniforms and carrying extradition paperwork that would pass any inspection. "You have two choices," the voice explained with chilling calm. "You can surrender peacefully and face justice in an American courtroom, or you can try to run and discover exactly how patient I can be when hunting prey." Candace collapsed into a chair, finally understanding the true scope of her situation. She hadn't just stolen money. She had entered into a blood feud with someone who had unlimited resources and no remaining humanity. Javier, more practical in his desperation, grabbed Candace's arm. "We run. Now, there has to be another way out of here." But as they reached the villa's rear exit, they found it blocked by armed men. Every window, every door, every possible escape route was covered. They were trapped in the paradise they had bought with Ethan's blood. The voice returned, now carrying a note of satisfaction that chilled them both to the bone. "Welcome to hell," Grant Harmon's ghost said softly. "I hope you find it comfortable. You'll be staying for a very long time." Chapter 7. The Hunt. The Costa Rican police found the villa empty except for scattered cash and abandoned luggage. According to official reports, Candace Harmon and Javier Keller had disappeared sometime during the night, apparently fleeing ahead of arrest warrants that were mysteriously delayed in processing. In reality, they had been taken to a facility that didn't appear on any map, a former military installation in the mountains that Marcus Webb had purchased through intermediaries. The compound was designed for interrogation and detention, staffed by professionals who specialized in extracting information from unwilling subjects. Candace and Javier were held in separate cells, unable to communicate with each other or the outside world. For the first week, their only human contact came from guards who delivered meals and said nothing. The psychological pressure was carefully calibrated, enough sensory deprivation to break down resistance, but not enough to damage their sanity completely. Webb wanted them functional for what came next. On the 8th day, Candace was brought to an interrogation room where Marcus Webb waited behind a one-way mirror. She saw only her own reflection, but his voice came through speakers with perfect clarity. "Hello, Candace. I hope your accommodations have been adequate." She looked terrible, hair unwashed, skin pale from lack of sunlight, eyes darting constantly as if searching for escape routes that didn't exist. But her voice still carried defiance. "Whatever you're planning, Grant, it won't work. People know where we were. When we disappear, there will be investigations." Webb's laugh was genuinely amused. "Well, there? Let's see. You're wanted for murder in Montana. You fled Costa Rica ahead of international arrest warrants. Your last known communications involved threats against law enforcement officials. To the outside world, you're dangerous fugitives who probably died trying to escape through the jungle." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "As for people who might miss you, well, you've spent the past 6 months alienating everyone you met. You have no family, no real friends. Even Javier, your partner in murder, has been telling our interrogators some fascinating stories about how you manipulated him into helping you." Candace's face crumpled as she realized the truth. She was completely alone, with no one to notice her disappearance and no resources to escape. "What do you want?" she whispered. "I want justice for my son, but not the kind you'd get in a courtroom. That would be too quick, too clean. I want you to understand what you took from me. I want you to experience the fear that Ethan felt when he couldn't breathe." The screen in front of Candace flickered to life, showing surveillance footage from their Thanksgiving dinner. She watched herself preparing the poisoned desserts, her face calm and calculating as she measured out doses that would kill a 3-year-old boy. "Did you know that strychnine causes tetanic seizures?" Webb's voice continued conversationally. "The victim remains conscious throughout, experiencing excruciating muscle contractions until they die from exhaustion or respiratory failure. My son suffered for nearly an hour before his little heart gave out." Candace began sobbing, but Webb felt no sympathy. "This was just the beginning. You're going to help me with an experiment," he said. "We're going to see how long the human spirit can endure before it breaks completely. You and Javier will provide the data." Meanwhile, in a similar room 50 feet away, Javier was receiving his own introduction to Webb's brand of justice. The former personal trainer was trying to maintain his tough guy facade, but months of paranoia had already cracked his confidence. "You can't hold us here forever," he blustered. "People will come looking. Will they?" Webb replied, "Let's examine your situation logically. You're a serial killer who preys on wealthy women. You have no legitimate family or friends. Your entire identity was built around deception and murder. Who exactly do you think will mount a rescue operation?" Javier's bravado crumbled as Webb displayed detailed files on his previous victims. The two women who had died before Candace, along with 3 others that law enforcement had never connected to him. "I know about Sarah Martinez in Tampa," Webb said softly. "The car accident that wasn't an accident. I know about Rebecca Chun in San Francisco. The overdose you administered when she started asking questions about her missing money. Should I continue?" The blood drained from Javier's face. He had been so careful, so clever. How had this man uncovered crimes that the FBI couldn't solve? "I've been studying you for months," Webb continued. "Every kill, every technique, every psychological trigger you use to manipulate your victims. You're predictable, Javier. Competent within your limited scope, but ultimately just another predator who got careless." Webb's voice hardened. "But you made one crucial mistake. You killed my son. That put you in a category reserved for people who have forfeited their right to exist." The torture wasn't physical. Webb was more sophisticated than that. Instead, he systematically destroyed their psychological defenses through carefully orchestrated psychological pressure. Candace was forced to watch endless footage of Ethan's short life. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, bedtime stories. Every moment of joy she had stolen was presented in excruciating detail. She began having nightmares where the little boy appeared to ask why she had hurt him. Javier's torment was different but equally effective. Webb had constructed detailed profiles of all his victims, showing how their lives had been cut short by his greed. He was forced to read their diaries, their final letters, their plans for futures that would never happen. But the cruelest torture was their isolation from each other. After months of mutual paranoia, they desperately wanted to reconcile, to find comfort in shared guilt. Instead, they received carefully edited recordings of each other's confessions, statements taken out of context to suggest betrayal and abandonment. Candace heard Javier claiming that the entire murder plot had been her idea, that he had been manipulated into helping. Javier heard Candace describing him as a psychopath who had threatened to kill her if she didn't cooperate. Neither recording was entirely false. Both contained grains of truth mixed with careful distortions. The result was the complete destruction of their relationship, replaced by hatred and blame. By the end of the second month, both prisoners were showing signs of severe psychological breakdown. Candace had developed a stutter and couldn't sleep without medication. Javier had begun talking to himself, carrying on conversations with his dead victims. But Webb wasn't satisfied with simple madness. He wanted something more permanent, more fitting to their crimes. On the 60th day of their captivity, he offered them a choice. "You can continue living here indefinitely," he told them through the intercom. "Comfortable enough to survive, miserable enough to suffer. Or you can accept my alternative offer." Candace looked up from her corner where she had been rocking back and forth. "What offer?" "Trial by combat. You and Javier, alone in a room with weapons. Winner gets to leave this place. Not free, but transferred to a minimum security facility where life will be bearable. Loser stays here forever." Javier immediately accepted, seeing it as his only chance for any improvement in his situation. Candace took longer to decide, but eventually agreed when Webb showed her video of Javier agreeing to the terms. The combat chamber was stark and simple. Concrete walls, bright lights, no furniture except for 2 tables at opposite ends. On each table lay a single weapon, a knife with a 6-inch blade. Webb watched from his observation room as his son's killers faced each other for the final time. They looked like broken dolls, thin, pale, trembling with exhaustion and fear. "This is for Ethan," Webb said quietly, knowing they couldn't hear him. "This is what you deserve." The fight was pathetic rather than dramatic. Neither Candace nor Javier was in any condition for real combat. They circled each other warily, making tentative attacks that accomplished little except drawing blood. But eventually, Javier's training and physical advantages began to tell. He managed to corner Candace near one of the walls, raising his knife for a killing blow. What happened next surprised even Webb. Instead of accepting death, Candace found a reserve of viciousness that had carried her through foster care and into adulthood. She grabbed Javier's wrist with both hands and drove her knee into his groin with desperate strength. As Javier doubled over in pain, Candace snatched his knife and plunged it into his back again and again, screaming incoherently as months of fear and rage finally found release. When it was over, she stood panting over Javier's corpse, covered in blood and trembling with exhaustion. Webb's voice came through the speakers, calm and unsurprised. "Congratulations, Candace. You've won your freedom." But as the door opened and guards approached to escort her out, Candace realized that Webb's definition of freedom might not match her own. Chapter 8. The Judgment. The minimum security facility that Webb had promised turned out to be a cottage on a remote island in the South Pacific. Candace was given comfortable quarters, adequate food, and access to books and television. She was even allowed to walk along the beach, though the island was 20 miles from the nearest land, surrounded by waters patrolled by Webb's security teams. It was a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. For the first month, Candace convinced herself that she could find a way to escape. She explored every inch of the island, tested the security systems, and tried to signal passing aircraft. But gradually, the reality of her situation became clear. Webb had created the perfect prison, one that would hold her until he decided otherwise. The psychological pressure continued in subtler forms. Candace received regular updates about the outside world, including news reports about the ongoing investigation into her crimes. Detective Richards had never stopped building his case, and with Javier dead and unable to contradict evidence, the prosecution seemed certain to proceed if she were ever captured. Webb also provided updates on his own activities. As Marcus Webb, he had established himself as a philanthropist and advocate for missing children. He funded organizations dedicated to preventing child abuse and supported research into family violence. Every charity donation was made in Ethan's memory, turning the murdered boy into a symbol of innocence lost. The irony was exquisite. Candace's victim was becoming more famous in death than he had ever been in life, while she was forgotten by everyone except the man hunting her. But Webb's masterpiece was yet to come. On the 6-month anniversary of her arrival on the island, Candace was taken to a communications room where a video conference had been arranged. On the screen appeared Detective Bob Richards, sitting in what appeared to be an official police station. "Mrs. Harmon," Richards said formally, "I'm here to inform you that we've concluded our investigation into your son's murder. We have sufficient evidence to proceed with charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and insurance fraud." Candace stared at the screen in confusion. "How did you find me?" "An anonymous tip led us to your location. You're being held on an island owned by a private security firm contracted by the U.S. government. Apparently, you've been in custody for months while we completed our investigation." Richards leaned forward, his expression serious. "You have two choices. You can waive extradition and return voluntarily to face trial in Montana. Or we can begin formal proceedings that will take years to complete but reach the same result. What happens if I come back voluntarily? You'll be charged with murder in the first degree. The evidence is overwhelming. Witness testimony, physical evidence, financial records. Your partner Javier Keller died in custody during an attempted escape, so he won't be available to testify against you. But we have his confession recorded before his death." Candace felt the last pieces of her world crumbling. What about my husband? I thought he was alive." Richards looked genuinely confused. "Ma'am, your husband died by suicide in Geneva. His body was recovered and cremated months ago." "I'm not sure what you mean." The video conference ended with Candace staring at a blank screen, finally understanding the full scope of Webb's revenge. He had created a scenario where she had only two choices: remain imprisoned on the island forever, or return to face trial for crimes that would put her on death row. Either way, she would never be free. But Webb saved his final revelation for last. That evening, as Candace sat on her cottage porch watching the sunset, a figure approached from the tree-line. She looked up to see Marcus Webb himself, the first time she had seen him in person since his transformation. He was completely unrecognizable as Grant Harmon. Taller, leaner, with different facial features and even different colored eyes. If she had passed him on the street, she would never have connected him to her dead husband. "Hello, Candace," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I thought it was time we talked face to face." She stared at him in fascination and horror. "You're really him. Grant, you're alive. Grant Harmon died the night you murdered his son. I'm someone else now. Someone created specifically to ensure that you pay for your crimes." Webb gestured toward the ocean, where the lights of a ship were visible on the horizon. "That's a U.S. Marshal's vessel. Detective Richards is quite real, as is his investigation. Tomorrow morning, you'll be taken aboard that ship and transported back to Montana to face trial. And if I refuse, then you'll remain here until you die of old age. This island is owned by one of my shell companies. You'll have food, shelter, basic comfort, but no freedom, no contact with the outside world, no possibility of escape. It's your choice." Candace looked out at the ship, then back at Webb. "Why? Why not just kill me? Why go through all this elaborate revenge?" Webb's expression remained calm, but something flickered in his eyes, a glimpse of the bottomless rage that drove him. "Because death will be mercy. Because my son suffered, and I want you to suffer too. Because you need to understand what you destroyed when you took his life." He stood to leave, then paused. "There's something else you should know. The trial you'll face, if you choose to face it, will be completely legitimate. Every piece of evidence is real. Every witness is genuine. I haven't fabricated anything that could be challenged in court. Then why are you so sure I'll be convicted?" Webb's smile was terrible in its serenity. "Because you're guilty, Candace. Because you murdered a 3-year-old boy for money. Because any jury that sees the evidence will want to see you executed." He began walking away, then called back over his shoulder. "The choice is yours. Life in prison, followed by execution, or life on this island, alone with your memories. Either way, you'll have plenty of time to think about what you did to my son." As Webb disappeared into the darkness, Candace was left alone with the sound of waves and the distant lights of the ship that would take her to trial. She had perhaps 12 hours to decide between two different kinds of hell. But in her heart, she already knew what she would choose. The island was beautiful, but it was a tomb. At least in prison, she would be among other people, even if they were criminals. At least in court, she would have lawyers, judges, some semblance of rights. She didn't yet understand that Webb had anticipated this choice, that even her trial would be another form of carefully orchestrated torture. The game was not over. It was entering its final phase. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. The trial of Candace Harmon became a media sensation, dubbed the Thanksgiving Murder by tabloids across the country. The prosecution painted her as a calculating killer who had murdered her own stepson for insurance money, while the defense struggled with the overwhelming evidence against their client. Webb watched every day of the proceedings from a gallery, sitting in the back row where Candace could see him, but the cameras could not. His new identity held up to scrutiny. Marcus Webb was simply a wealthy philanthropist with an interest in child welfare cases. The evidence was damning beyond any reasonable doubt. The prosecution presented the poisoned desserts, the insurance policies, the suspicious behavior before and after the murders. They showed how Candace had systematically isolated herself from anyone who might testify to her character, how she had fled the country when questioned by police. But the most devastating testimony came from Detective Richards, who methodically laid out the timeline of the crimes. The jury saw photographs of little Ethan Harmon, alive and laughing at his last birthday party. They heard recordings of Candace's cold voice planning Grant's murder in Geneva. The defense attorney, a competent lawyer named Brian Golden, tried to argue that Candace had been manipulated by Javier Keller. He suggested that she had been a victim of an abusive relationship, coerced into participating in crimes she never would have committed alone. But the prosecution had anticipated this defense. They presented evidence of Candace's previous relationships, showing a pattern of manipulation and emotional cruelty. They demonstrated that she had been the driving force behind the murder plot, not Javier. Webb had ensured that every detail was perfect, every piece of evidence unassailable. The trial wasn't about determining guilt. It was about watching Candace's final destruction play out in public. On the 15th day of testimony, the prosecution called their final witness, Marcus Webb himself. He took the stand with quiet dignity, identifying himself as a philanthropist who had become interested in the case through his advocacy work. His testimony was brief but devastating. "I've spent considerable time studying family violence and child murder," Webb told the jury. "What makes this case particularly horrific is the calculated nature of the crime. This wasn't a moment of passion or desperation. Mrs. Harmon planned and executed the murder of a 3-year-old child with the same care most people put into planning a vacation." Webb's voice remained steady, professional, as he continued. "Ethan Harmon was a beautiful, innocent child who trusted the woman who killed him. She served him poison disguised as a treat, then watched him die in agony. There is no punishment severe enough for such an act." When the defense attorney cross-examined him, Webb was unshakable. He answered every question with factual precision, never showing emotion, never giving the defense any opening to challenge his credibility. Candace watched her former husband testify with growing despair. She understood now that every aspect of her trial had been choreographed by the man she had betrayed. Even her own defense attorney was unknowingly following a script that Webb had written. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase was equally swift. Montana law provided for the death penalty in cases involving the murder of children, and the jury recommended execution without hesitation. Judge Phil Driscoll, a different man than the fake inspector who had called Candace in Costa Rica, sentenced her to death by lethal injection. As he read the sentence, his voice carried the weight of absolute moral certainty. "Mrs. Harmon, you have been convicted of the most heinous crime imaginable, the murder of an innocent child for financial gain. You have shown no remorse, no recognition of the enormity of your actions. This court sentences you to death, and may God have mercy on your soul." Candace was transferred to the women's death row facility in Montana, where she would await execution for what would likely be many years. The appeals process would drag on, but the outcome was never in doubt. The evidence was too strong, the crime too horrific. Webb visited her once in prison, 6 months after her sentencing. He sat across from her in the visiting room, separated by bulletproof glass, speaking through a telephone that recorded every word. "Hello, Candace," he said softly. "How are you adjusting to your new home?" She looked terrible. Prison had aged her a decade in 6 months. Her hair was gray, her skin pale, her eyes haunted by nightmares that never ended. "Why?" she whispered into the phone. "You've won. I'm going to die here. Why keep torturing me?" Webb's expression remained impassive. "Because my son is still dead. Because you took away the only good thing in my life. Because you need to understand that some sins can never be forgiven." "I'm sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry about Ethan. I was wrong. I was evil, I admit it. Isn't that enough?" Webb studied her for a long moment, seeing the broken woman who had once been his wife. She was genuinely remorseful now, destroyed by guilt and fear. A better man might have felt pity. But Grant Harmon had died with his son that night, and Marcus Webb felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "No," he said finally, "it's not enough. It will never be enough." He stood to leave, then paused. "I've established a foundation in Ethan's name. It provides support for other families who have lost children to violence. Every year on his birthday, we hold a memorial service where people share stories about innocent lives cut short." Webb's smile was arctic. "Your name is mentioned at every service, Candace. Not as a person, but as a reminder of the evil that good people must guard against. You've become a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when someone chooses greed over love." He walked away without looking back, leaving Candace alone with the knowledge that her crime would outlive her, that she would be remembered only as a monster who killed a child for money. Years later, when Candace Harmon was finally executed by lethal injection, Marcus Webb watched from the observation gallery. He felt no satisfaction in her death, that had come from watching her suffer, from knowing that she had spent her final years in terror and isolation. As the drugs took effect and her life ebbed away, Webb thought about his son. Ethan would have been 8 years old now, probably playing Little League baseball or learning to ride a bike. All the experiences that Candace had stolen when she chose murder over mercy. When it was over, Webb returned to his new life. Marcus Webb continued his philanthropic work, funding organizations that protected children and supported victims of violence. He never married again, never had other children. His entire existence was dedicated to ensuring that Ethan's death had meaning, that some good could come from senseless tragedy. But late at night, in the privacy of a secure home, Webb would sometimes allow himself to remember the man he had been before. Grant Harmon had been capable of love, hope, and forgiveness. Marcus Webb was something harder, colder, forged in the fires of loss and tempered by the need for justice. He had kept his promise to his son. The people who had murdered Ethan Harmon had paid for their crimes in full. Javier was dead, killed by his own partner in blood. Candace was dead, executed by the state after years of psychological torment. The debt was settled. The scales were balanced. But Grant Harmon's heart remained buried in a small grave in Montana, next to the son who would never grow up to become the man he might have been. Some victories, Webb had learned, felt exactly like defeat, but they were still victories. And sometimes that had to be enough. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.